In this episode, we're going to be covering a variety of different examples of notes that we could typically be receiving from a director or client that we would have had on our shots, and how to go about addressing them. Receiving and addressing notes is a pivotal and important part of visualization and allows us to get closer to the director's original vision, or even give the chance to offer up and explore new creative ideas too. To begin with, I just want to tell you about one of the brilliant tools that we like to use for visual collaboration within your team called FRAM.io. You can use it to review media files such as images and videos, whilst being able to make notes and drawings in real time or offline. For those of you familiar with the software SyncSketch, it works in quite a similar way. Anyone with a link provided to them can join as a guest and view and contribute to the project, making it such a fantastic tool for video collaboration and note making. At our current stage, we have a first pass of the entire sequence completed and in a solid place with a full edit having been put together from the client. Now that we've gone through the edit, let's see what notes the director has left for us. Right off the bat, the first note is the camera work in our opening shot. So the director wants the camera to track down and reveal the corpse, rather than pulling back and keeping that handheld feel like in the original shot. In the original, we had a handheld shake, but the new direction is to have a more static camera with a tilt down to reveal the scene, instead of the backwards track to reveal. So let's go ahead and tackle this first. It's always a good idea to create a new version when making changes, especially when other members of your team could be making variations or going back and reusing the original version. To start with, we'll copy the latest version of the Blender file into our variation 01 task that we've just made. Then we can dive straight into making changes. So the first request was to remove the camera shake, which is pretty simple enough. We can just go into the camera settings and down to our Shakeify add-on and just remove the shake by hitting the minus button on the right. This will make sure that the camera feels more static, like it's on a tripod or a track. Remember, an important rule and one of the best ways to sell VFX and make it feel more real is by creating camera moves that would be physically possible in real life by a real camera operator. Now we can go ahead and find a good framing. We can frame up this wider section where we can see a bit more of the tree in the midground, as it helps to create a border around our subject. I'll set a keyframe for the initial position and then remove the rest of the keyframes to keep the camera in its current position. So from here, the next part is to deal with the tilt. So let's set it so that the camera slowly tilts down to reveal the environment, eventually focusing on the crow picking at the carcass. So if we just go into our graph editor, we can stretch the keys out on our x-axis so that the speed of the tilt now takes longer. We want to make sure that we're using Bezier keys at the start and end so that we get a gradual start and stop instead of an immediate halt, sort of to create more of an easing effect. Now, the shot has a nice slow curve that establishes our environment before we pan down to reveal the subject and then the crow. I'd say that we've covered that note well. So the camera shake is gone, we have a nice smooth tilt down, and the camera is remaining static. Before we finalise though, I think it's important that we check the depth of field to make sure our focus is sharp on the crow. Now you can see we're properly focused on the crow, and the shot is looking much better. I think we should also do a minor lighting tweak just to draw more attention to the crow by adjusting the sun's direction a bit. It's subtle, but you can see that it helps to keep the focus where we want it, on the crow. So making that the brightest part of the shot is really important. One last thing is to just go ahead and check the composition. So we can go ahead and turn on the rule of thirds guide to ensure that the framing is lining up nicely. As you can see, currently it's not quite hitting the mark, so we can just nudge the camera slightly so that the crow ends up in the middle third. That's now looking a lot better. So with that note addressed, we can now move on to the next note, which is to add some more life to the street in shot 2, as it's currently looking quite empty and flat in its current state. So we can actually just go ahead and add in some characters in the midground and in the background, so we can make the town feel a bit more lived in. And maybe we could also go and add some horses and some more detailed environment assets, like this stagecoach, for example. As visualization artists, we're given the option to have some creative input here to offer up ideas and options to the director. For this shot, for example, we can creatively suggest that adding something to the foreground would help to frame this shot better and add more depth. So we can just grab a couple of assets from Blender Kit that we feel make sense for the context of this scene, such as this wooden wagon and this set of wooden crates. And you can just place these strategically in the foreground. You can see how now the focus is more on the center of the frame, as these objects are framing the shot and guiding our eyes to the important points on screen. So the next note, in shot 4, we can see that the director wants our hero to be walking through the frame in this shot, sort of establishing him first entering the town. It'll also help us to get a better sense of direction if we do this, as well as adding some more drama and build up to the actual scene itself. In the shot after this, we actually have the hero just standing in front of the church. But now the note from the director says that we want to establish him entering the town. It's important to note that later down the line, we're going to need to flip the characters so that the villain is now in front of the church and not the hero, as their positions have actually flipped. Let's just start with a note on shot 4. Now we can go ahead and bring in our hero to the shot. We can clean up the outliner and then append in the walking animation that we retargeted earlier. On first look, there are a few issues with the arms, but that's easy enough to fix by removing the keyframes on the IK poles of the elbows. You can edit the keyframes of animation layers in your NLA editor by hitting Tab. The layer will go green and then give you access to the keyframes within that layer. And there you go, just as simple as that, shot 4 has been addressed. Our hero now walks through the frame. The next note is for shot 7, and we touched upon this earlier. We've now established that our hero is actually just walking into town and that he's swapped places with the villain, and the villain is now the one standing in front of the church. With the shot in its current state, we haven't actually established the hero coming to a stop, or him being in the correct location at all. So we're going to need to change the dynamics of the shot entirely, but we still need the camera to stay on the same side of his body that it currently is. There's a pretty simple setup we can do to easily flip the location of our two characters whilst maintaining theirs and the camera's current animation and local positions. We can do this just by using an empty plane axis. So let's create an empty locator and place it roughly between our two characters, or roughly at the central pivot point between the two. What we'll do here is parent the camera and the characters to this empty. You can either hold shift and drag the camera and characters under the empty in the outliner, or you could simply use a child of constraint to the camera and the characters, and then select the empty plane axis as the target object. Now with that set up, we can simply rotate the empty locator 180 degrees, and just like that, the characters have swapped places while the camera and animations have remained fixed. With that done, we'll need to address the lighting. Since the characters have swapped sides, the light now might look off. In Previs, you'll often adjust the light per shot to make each shot look visually more appealing in its own way, but we still need to try and maintain some form of consistency with light direction. So I'm just going to flip the light source so that it hits the correct direction, ensuring that it's highlighting the character's face, revealing the eyes more clearly. That's looking a lot better. Now, the final part of the note was to have the character walk in and come to a stop. In the previous shot, shot 4, that we just worked on, we have established that he's actually walking into town. I've loaded the animation into the NLA editor, used the blend in and out tools to merge the walk to stop layer and original action we had in this shot where the character was stood still looking around. The main thing is to make sure that the walk's endpoint is matching the position of our character we have already established. Once you've blended these together, the walk transitions nicely into our hero stopping and looking around. Now, it just comes down to smaller tweaks with the blending of those animation tracks and the positioning of the character to make sure the transition is as smooth as possible. Once we've addressed that, I think it's important to look at the camera. I think we should have the camera tilting down at the beginning of the shot so that we can catch the character entering the frame from a distance. We need to make sure to position the frame with the rule of thirds in mind, ensuring that the character stays centered and is framed properly throughout the shot. you should go into your graph editor and smooth out the camera rotation, specifically on that X-axis. We can adjust it so that the tilt isn't too fast and doesn't feel abrupt. By slowing down the tilt, the camera movement feels more natural as the character walks in and the centre of our frame meets him nicely at his endpoint. Another point to remember, always keep the centre of your camera's focus on or behind the character's central line when they are moving in a particular direction, never in front, as that would suggest that the camera operator knows where the character is heading, which breaks immersion. So we just need to make sure that the camera remains slightly behind our character's central line as he's walking in. Now you see, as the character walks into frame, the central point of the character's face, which is our main subject focus, and the centre of the frame meet perfectly in the middle. This now looks much better. Also, if you notice any snapping in the animation, like we have here, you can play around with the blend in and out settings some more. You can just adjust the timing of these so it glides in and out a bit more smoothly without looking too jarring. We can push things further by adding some subtle camera shake to disguise any minor roughness in the animation and give the shot a little bit more life, as if it was being held by an actual camera operator. So now we've got our hero walking into frame. The camera is tracking the character's action without going in front of his central line until he comes to a stop, and our lighting is looking good. We can now move on to the note for shot 6. This note is all about the framing of the camera when we're focusing on the clock. The idea is to make it more central and shoot it from a lower, more dramatic angle, rather than shooting it from this 3/4 angle that it's currently at. This one is pretty straightforward, so let's dive straight into it. As usual, we're starting by copying over the latest version of our previous variation into a new task called Variation 01. Now that we're in the shot, it's just a matter of addressing the simple camera change. We've already got a subtle, slow push, which already makes it feel more tense, but we do need to ensure it stays central and isn't on that 3/4 angle. So what we can go ahead and do is apply a track 2 constraint to the camera, and selecting the target as the hands of the clock. The track 2 constraint means that the camera's central point will always be tracking or focusing on whatever the selected target is, and this way when we move the camera, it always tracks the center point on the clock. Now, the note has asked for a more central angle and not that 3/4 shot, and they want it from a slightly lower perspective. So we can just go ahead and adjust the angle of the camera, and we can make sure that it's perfectly straight and aligned by just zeroing out those translations. Now we can just key the location at the start, push in, and key it again at the end. Then we can set it to linear interpolation for continuous and direct motion throughout the entire shot. And there you can see that we've created a more dramatic and lower angle, but with the same camera push. Next up, again, now that our villain and hero have swapped sides, we need to go back and adjust the shot of our villain's close-up reveal to help with continuity. Just like we did in the shot with our hero, we're going to pair the camera to an empty plane axis that we can use as a character's control to flip them 180. And now when we go to the camera, the church is behind the villain, exactly as intended. Let's finally turn shadows back on and adjust the lighting for continuity in the viewport shader. So the light source again is coming from the top and at a slight angle, so we need to keep that consistent with the other shots, but of course we're lighting per shot to make it more visually pleasing. We can also go ahead and rotate the viewport HDRI just to get a bit more indirect bounce on the villain's face so that it's not so dark. Reducing the shadow intensity here helps to get a bit more visibility on the character's face, which is important. This now looks a lot better. We've got more visually pleasing lighting which illuminates our subject well, whilst maintaining the continuity of the light established in previous shots. Now we can move on to the final shot change. The director's note is for the clock striking 12. As you can see, originally it was a smooth sweep of the clock hand, but we sort of want to create a ticking effect, building that tension and drama as if it's the heartbeat of the scene. So let's work on that now. So we've already set up the camera move, and we can now focus on getting that ticking animation. To achieve that, we can use constant interpolation, giving us that ticking effect. I'll keyframe the hand's position at regular intervals. Let's do this every second, and we'll use 25 frames for each tick. Once we've keyed out those positions, we can switch the interpolation to constant, and just like that, we've got a ticking clock hand instead of a sweeping one. It's a quick way to create that heartbeat tension in the scene. We can now go ahead and get these rendered and saved, and we're all set. So in this next section, we're going to walk through a common scenario where a client would request a particular adjustment to a shot because they plan to replicate it in a real life set. So for the case of this shot, the client will be using the technical information that we can gather from this scene, such as camera distance and speed measurements, as well as height and movement in relation to the actor and the environment models that we have made based on measurements that they've sent us. This is because we need to guide the client in replicating this shot in real life on set. And this process is typically called technical visualization, or TechViz. Whilst we won't be covering this in depth in this series, it's typically used to inform the crew and director about how to capture the creative vision of a scene in real life, which is outlined during the previz process. TechViz is based on virtual assets and captured footage to validate camera placement, lens choices and camera moves, so it's vitally important that the camera's position and movement, as well as the characters in relation to the environment, is physically possible to replicate. In this example, the character looks fine from the camera's view, but as soon as you step out into a perspective view, you'll notice that he's floating off the ground, which is obviously not something that can be replicated in real life. To fix this, we can't just move the camera down directly, as this would mess up the animation and he would snap back into his original position. Instead, we can use an offset technique. So first we can go ahead and create an empty object. Let's just say a plane axis, for example. And you can use the copy transforms constraint to match the transforms of our character control, and you can map those onto the offset that we've just created. Once the offset has snapped to the character's exact transforms, we can parent the character rig to the empty object. And then we can just call this something like our hero control or hero character control. With this setup, we can move the character down without affecting its animation. So now we can move to focusing on the camera. We can create a new camera and attach it to a rig with a master offset and a translation control, both using empty locators. And we've covered how to set these up and the importance of using them in detail back in episode 5. So be sure to go ahead and watch that before carrying on with this section of the tutorial. We can now go ahead and move the master offset roughly into position, and we want to try and mirror the original version of this shot, as the client was happy with the camera move itself, but we need to make it work so that it's possible to replicate. As you can see, if we frame up the original composition of this shot, we see that the character's face and upper torso is now in frame because we moved the camera down to ground level. This isn't supposed to be revealed in the story yet, and also becomes quite a distraction, as the focus is supposed to be on the sheriff at this point. So to fix this, we just need to do a simple composition change. We can use the camera's translation locator to shift the camera down, and then selecting the camera, we can rotate and frame back up so that the sheriff returns to center frame, whilst also making sure that we only see our foreground character's holster and legs as he's walking through the frame. This means that we've maintained the original composition of the shot that the client was happy with, but also now made it possible to replicate as the character, or the actor in the real world, is now grounded in our 3D scene instead of floating. So the technical information can now be accurately recorded and sent to the client. And there we go. So now everything looks correct from the camera's point of view. The character is grounded in real space and actually able to do this move. And most importantly, the client will have the real world measurements from the camera and the characters and the set, so they can match this shot in real life. Another really useful tip you can use for composing your shots is to utilize the background images tool inside of the camera settings. This will allow you to attach an image or video to your camera's view and can be used in a variety of different ways. In our case, we can go ahead and add in an image of a 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio cinematic bars that you would typically see on a widescreen cinematic production or film. This will now help us to frame and compose our shots better and give us a guide for how much of the shot you would actually see on a widescreen production, and will help to further guide the client too by giving them a visual representation of it for their edit. It's really important to make sure that your virtual environment can seamlessly translate into the physical world.
And I hope this section helps you understand sort of how to handle similar situations in your own work.